All right. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for coming out tonight to the third event in the Forest Speaker Series hosted by the Humanities Center at Texas Tech. I'm Michael Borshuk. I am an associate professor of English at Texas Tech and the director of the Humanities Center. And we're very glad to have you here tonight for Self-Portrait with Dogwood, a conversation with Christopher Merrill. Before I turn things over to tonight's host, I want to make just a couple of quick announcements about the Humanities Center at Texas Tech. As I said at the top of my remarks, this is one in a series that we're hosting through the spring semester, and we have 3 more events coming up before late April. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to register for our next 3 events. Later this month and on March 25th, we have the photography of trees and forests. And then 2 more events in April. On April 8th, a panel on tree law moderated by Texas Tech Horn professor Vicki Sutton. And then we wrap up the Forest Speaker Series on April 22nd on Earth Day with Thinking Like a Forest, Cities as Living Systems, a panel discussion. All of these events are Thursday nights at 7:30 p.m. Central. You can register for them at the Humanities Center's website, Humanities Center, all one word, .ttu.edu, under the events tab. And I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And that's an easy way to stay on top of all of the events that we host virtually for now, and sometime in the future we'll be back in person in Lubbock as well. Also, the Forest Speakers Series events, usually about a day or 2 after the event itself, they appear on our YouTube channel. So I would encourage you also to find the Humanities Center at Texas Tech on YouTube, and you can see past events archived in video there. One other scheduling announcement I'd like to call attention to. Coterminous with the Forest Speaker Series this semester, we're also hosting a series of Wednesday afternoon brown bag academic talks featuring Texas Tech faculty who are recent funding recipients from the Humanities Center. And the next one is coming up in the next week, March 10th. Tanya Calamaneri, who is a professor of dance, will be speaking, and there are 3 more after that, March 24th, April 7th, and April 24th. Again, just like the Forest Speakers Series events, you can register for them on our website under the events tab. Those events are Wednesday afternoons, 12 noon Central, and they run for an hour with a talk and Q&A. I encourage you to register for those and see all of the exciting research the different humanities faculty are doing here at Texas Tech. And then finally, as always, I'd like to read the Humanities Center at Texas Tech's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Humanities Center at Texas Tech opens its officially sponsored events with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous people on whose lands we host our talks and gatherings. The center opens its events with this gesture as part of our commitment to respecting the shared humanity of different populations across diverse cultural traditions, and to remembering with clarity the complex and violent truths of our history. With that in mind, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we stand, the traditional homelands of the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We pay respect to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, trauma, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. With those announcements out of the way, I am going to turn things over to our host for the evening, my colleague in the English department, Curtis Bauer, who is a professor of creative writing and translation, who will introduce our featured speaker tonight and also moderate our Q&A. Thank you, Curtis.
Great. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another conversation about forests, about trees, and about what it means to be human right here in this moment, and how an understanding of the humanities helps us make connections to seemingly disparate events, objects, fields of study. I'm proud that we, the members of the TTU Humanities Center Forest Programming Team and the larger University in West Texas community can create a space this evening for Christopher Merrill's talk and the following conversation with you, all of our guests. I've been thinking about the threads. There are many, the weave is intricate, joining the discussions and talks we've had so far in this series. and those yet to come, as I've spent the last week rereading the dog-eared pages of each book Christopher Merrill has written, at least the ones that I own, including the collections of poems, Necessities, Boat, selections from his forthcoming book, Flares, which will be available in May of this year, as well as his nonfiction books, Only the Nails Remain, Scenes from the Balkan Wars, Things of the Hidden God, Journey to the Holy Mountain, The Tree of the Doves, Ceremony, Expedition, War, and Self-Portrait with Dogwood. I'm only partially embarrassed to say that the books are a mess of bends and folds and underlinings, too many to quote to you now, though I can't help reading from the beginning of Self-Portrait with Dogwood, in which Chris writes, "The average lifespan of a flowering dogwood is 80 years. And at the approach of my 60th birthday, it occurred to me that I might create a self-portrait in relation to a tree that from an early age I have regarded as a talisman. Not a memoir, strictly speaking, but a literary exploration of certain events through the lens of nature, a taking stock of a journey destined to end in the earth." In this book, he quotes from everyone, and this sounds like a hyperbolic generalization, but I assure you it's not. Making connections that humanists make, drawing from his readings and conversations with naturalists, historians, politicians, scientists, soldiers interrogating him at gunpoint, theologians, and poets, of course. One of whom is Chris's mentor and friend, the celebrated poet and translator, the late W.S. Merwin, who was equally known for his work as a conservationist, in particular for his painstaking restoration of depleted flora, including hundreds of species of palm on the remote former pineapple plantation in Hawaii, where he made his home. In the book Chris is going to be reading from tonight, Chris describes a meal with Merwin thus: "An owl hooted, the palms swayed in the wind, and when, as often happened, our conversation turned to the environmental crisis, which William had taken to calling the final solution, I wondered how he managed to avoid despair. 'Look,' Merwin said, 'if you're driving down the road and you see a terrible accident, you don't stop to ask whether anyone will live. You get out of your car and do what you can to save them.' This was the spirit of activism that coursed through some of his most memorable poems, including Witness, which had become for me a sort of charm. And the poem is, I want to tell what the forests were like. I will have to speak in a forgotten language. William was my tutor in that forgotten language. His sense of a poet's obligation in the face of catastrophe surely influenced my own." And I misquoted that. That comes from the book Tree of the Doves. I started mixing some of these up. But tonight we're going to witness what comes from one's awareness of the expanse of his obligations and Chris's tireless engagement with the world and the consequence of that engagement. In his praise for Christopher Merrill's book, Self-Portrait with Dogwood, Elliot Weinberger writes, "An arboreal memoir, an autobiographical dendrology. Merrill, like the dogwood seeds and seedlings, roams the planet, appearing or pausing at unexpected moments in history. The migrant trees sink their roots in various foreign soils. The man, though wandering even in zones of war, remains rooted in the humus of poetry." How this book begins, it also ends with contemplation of the dogwood seed, and in this case, seeds he has, a gift from a friend at the State Department, where he'll plant them, how he will nurture them in the inclement climate of Iowa for the flowering dogwoods he envisions in his yard, imagining a future where, quote, "these dogwoods will eventually grow in full sun, producing more flowers in the spring and brighter color in the fall, attracting birds, squirrels, raccoons, and deer from the ravine. At the first sign of disease, blight, or anthracnose, or powdery mildew, the dead or dying branches must be pruned and fallen leaves raked up, which I will do, if I am still around. If not, I'll take comfort in the knowledge that something remains." This and Chris's other books, his insight into the human condition and his kindness and generosity also remain, waiting now in his conversation with us, which I'm sure will remain with us long after this evening. Please welcome Christopher Merrill.
Thank you, Curtis. That was a really elegant introduction, and I'm very grateful to you and to Michael and to so many old friends here in this virtual space. What a lovely gathering. Thank you all. I thought that I would begin by just saying a few words about how this book came to be, because for many of my friends, they will know that I spent many years poo-pooing the very idea of writing memoirs. Just is not in my nature. I think that I grew up with a certain kind of reticence, and the notion of writing a memoir seemed to me to be the height of hubris. And then Barbara Rass, who was then the publisher of Trinity University Press, and I were in a cab on the way to a restaurant for dinner, and she mentioned that she was beginning a series of books called The Life of Trees. And she was going to enlist a bunch of writers to write about a particular tree. She asked if I was interested, and I said, without thinking, I want to do the dogwood. And in due course, a contract came to write this book. The notion was that the book had to be 40 to 50,000 words. It had to include something about the folklore associated with the tree, with the ecological framework in which it can be found, with the name itself. And there were really pretty strict rules, and I set about writing. And I should say that the series seemed to come to nothing, which is, of course, what happens a lot in the writing world. We launch things just like seeds of dogwood trees, and they either take shape or they don't. But in my case, I found suddenly that in the course of writing about the dogwood's name, about the history that we know of it and diseases that it has faced, it suddenly became possible for me to write about a number of events that had happened in my life. At almost every turn, it seemed to me there was a dogwood tree or two in the background, and that by some strange alchemy, it became a way for me to take stock at a certain point in my life. So I thought I'm just going to read a little bit of what Curtis just read for you, but to set the tone for the book, and then I'll read part of another chapter. This is from the prologue. And of course, it's, you write the prologue or the preface last. So it was after I had figured out, I'd written this book and realized I'd written a memoir. I better find some way to justify what I had done. So this is what I wrote. The average lifespan of a flowering dogwood is 80 years. And at the approach of my 60th birthday, it occurred to me that I might create a self-portrait in relation to a tree that from an early age I have regarded as a talisman. Not a memoir, strictly speaking, but a literary exploration of certain events through the lens of nature, but taking stock of a journey destined to end in the earth. In the course of researching dogwoods, the common name for the woody plants of the Cornus genus found in temperate climates throughout North America, Europe, and Asia, I realized that a number of formative moments in my life had some connection to the tree named, according to one writer, because its fruit was not fit for a dog. In the nursery trade, dogwoods are called ornamentals. They're flowering a high point of spring, but they serve critical functions in the ecosystem as well. And since they have informed so much of my life, it seemed to me that an extended meditation on the intersection between personal and natural history might hold interest, if for no other reason than to offer a different way of thinking about the tradition of writing memoirs. A small deciduous tree, the flowering dogwood belongs to the understory in a hardwood forest, occupying the middle space between the ground and sky, providing nectar for pollinating insects, branches and foliage and fruit for perching and nesting songbirds, nutrients for the soil, ingredients for medicines, wood for bowls and shuttles and tools, and an open invitation for an aging man to reflect on his walk in the sun, to reconsider his relationship to nature, to pay attention to the worlds revolving in his memory, his imagination, and all around him. So I begin a kind of excursus through different moments in my life, starting with JFK's assassination. There was a dogwood in our backyard, and I remember possibly my first real memory was climbing into that tree on the day of JFK's funeral, and trying to, at the age of 5, trying to make some kind of sense about what had transpired in those days. And then I go on to other events. And what I wanted to talk to you about tonight, what I wanted to read, was something from from my life as a nurseryman. Among the many jobs I've had in my life was that I put myself through graduate school in Seattle as a nurseryman. Eventually ended up getting becoming a master gardener, and this was how I made a living for a long time. So suddenly I had a chance, it seemed to me, to be able to write about some of the more interesting parts of that life. And one of them was that I worked for this crazy old guy named Jerry Monroe, who was one of those people you would say had a real green thumb. He was also a bit of a rascal, and so working in his nursery gave me a chance to see a little something about human nature. And I thought that I would just read you something about this from one of the chapters about Jerry Monroe. Let's see which one I wanted to do here. Okay. That's actually not the one I wanted to do. All right, we'll go with this then. This is a chapter called Compost. The dump truck parked in the back of the nursery was filled with flattened 5-gallon cans, plastic trays, pesticide containers, newspapers, food wrappings. What could not be composted wound up in the truck, which I did not know even ran until one rainy autumn morning when Jerry told me to climb into the passenger seat. We set out for a landscaping job in Issaquah. He was silent the whole trip, once again refusing to answer my questions. I should say the backdrop to this is that some weeks before that, a customer had come in on a Saturday morning. He wanted to buy some bunch berries that were on sale. I made a very big sale to him, about 30 of them, and I charged the wrong price. And in the course of that, managed to shortchange the nursery by several $100s. And so what ended up happening was that, the foreman and I tried to hide this faux pas on my part, and Jerry seemed not to notice it. He was a mercurial man who noticed some things all the time and some things not. He famously went into the woods one day to dig up some maidenhair ferns to sell. They were on the endangered list. Of course, he couldn't sell them, but he dug them up anyway. And he found growing in this area where he was looking for maidenhair ferns a bunch of pot plants. And this infuriated this man who was, partly a thief. And so instead of taking the maidenhair ferns, he dug up the pot plants, put them in the back of his pickup truck, drove into town to deliver them to the police station. But on the way to the police station, he thought he would stop at the local hotel where he often had lunch. And he ordered a hamburger and a cup of coffee, and he fell asleep at the table. And of course, then the police are driving by and they see all these pot plants growing in the back of his truck. They come in to arrest him. They didn't arrest him because they'd had a number of experiences like that with him. So this is the kind of guy he is. Anyway, one day, about a week after I had made this huge mistake, I was standing by the truck. I'd just been filling up other trucks with bark and peat moss and things like that. And he said to me to get into the truck, and we started driving to Seattle. This was, the nursery was in Kirkwood, and we're driving to Seattle, and I am asking him questions, and he's not answering any of the questions. And I start to think, well, he's figured it out, so he's going to fire me. But it's an odd way to get fired. Maybe he's driving me to my house. I rented a house in Seattle. And we drive, and he's not answering any questions. So I'm assuming he's very angry. We drive past the exit to my house, and I think, well, that didn't work out. So I don't know what he's doing. We start heading north, and we keep driving, and I kept asking him questions, and he kept not saying anything. And I think to myself, my God, he really must be angry. He's going to drive me to Canada and leave me there to try to hitchhike home or something. And finally, we pull off in Everett, Washington, and we pull into a mall. And I'm thinking to myself, this is just crazy. I mean, okay, I screwed up, but really, do you have to take me to this mall? And he hands me $60, and I'm thinking, well, that's not what he owed me for the week, but I guess this is how he's saying goodbye. And he said his wife was a landscape painter, and she was in a group art show in this mall, and nobody had bought any of her paintings that week. So I, as the artistic one, was supposed to go into the mall in my work clothes and work boots and look around at all the paintings and make a big fuss over buying a painting for her, which I did. And then we drove back to the nursery. He gave the painting to the foreman and drove off. 3 to 4 days later, his wife showed up at the nursery, and we never saw her at the nursery. And this time she showed up, and she came right up to me, and she said, you think you're pretty clever, don't you? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, Jerry is so stupid. He left the receipt for the painting in his pocket of his pants, and she had found that. So of course she had figured out what had been done. So this is the backdrop to this trip to drop some stuff off. I should also say he had a habit of not paying his bills. And at one point there was a moment when every Friday, one person had to stay late at the end of the day. And on one particular Friday, it was my turn to stay late. And the police showed up to arrest him for not paying his bills. And so Jerry said to me, okay, listen, you stay here until I get there so you can come and bail me out. An hour passes, he calls and he says, I need $250 for you to bail me out. So he said, take what's in the till. And I said, well, Jerry, there's only about $80 in the till. And he said, okay, then bring me your pay. And I said, well, I would, Jerry, except that once again, you didn't pay me everything you owe me. So it doesn't add up to $250. So he said, well, then call my wife. So I called his wife and I said, Jerry needs money to be bailed out. What do you want me to do? And she said, it will do him good to spend a night in jail. Tell him we'll bring him money tomorrow. So I stopped by the jail on the way home and I said, Jerry, we don't have enough money. Jean doesn't have enough money. It was spring. We should be able to get the money by noon tomorrow because it was a Saturday. And that morning we had a lot of business. And I said to the foreman, should we go bail out Jerry? And he said, no, are you kidding me? This is so nice not having him around, isn't it? So by the time we went to bail him out about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he was pretty irate. So that's a long way of setting up this little bit here where I'm driving along with him. What could not be composted wound up in the trunk, which I did not know even ran until one rainy autumn morning when Jerry told me to climb into the passenger seat. We set out for a landscaping job in Issaquah. He was silent the whole trip, once again refusing to answer my questions, intent, it seemed, on the slick road. Nor would he explain why he turned down a muddy driveway 1.5 miles short of the work site. He pulled up in front of a ranch house belonging to a creditor, backed onto the lawn, and raised the bed to dump 10 tons of trash on the grass. What are you doing? I asked, appalled. Jerry shook his head, a devilish grin spreading across his face, and shifted into first gear to drive away, only to become stuck in the mud. He revved the engine, rocking forward and back, and as the tires churned, sinking into the earth, His smirk gave way to a look of panic. He switched off the engine and ordered me to get the foreman. As I started up the driveway, he cried, "Run!" But my boots were heavy, the mud was deep, and so I jogged the road before slowing to a walk. When I got to the work site, the foreman was waiting in his car. He was neither surprised to hear what Jerry had done, nor sympathetic to his plight. He shook his head, smiled. "Have some coffee," he said, passing me the thermos. He took a dip of snuff and refilled his cup. 10 more minutes went by before we set out to rescue Jerry. In those days, I was reading Walt Whitman's post-Civil War poems, which reveal how the carnage darkened his understanding of the human condition. And at the sight of the debris scattered across the lawn, I recalled This Compost, a poem that enacts a journey from terror to acceptance of the complicated processes at the heart of existence. Whitman, startled by something when he thinks he is safest, retreats from the woods he loves and poses a series of difficult questions. Oh, how can it be that the ground itself does not sicken? How can you be alive, you growths of spring? How can you furnish health, you blood of herbs, roots, orchards, grain? Are they not continually putting distempered corpses within you? Is not every continent worked over and over with sour dead? The earth in the aftermath of the Civil War held the remains of some 800,000 people killed in the fighting, and Whitman's voluntary service to wounded soldiers in the hospitals of the nation's capital had brought him face to face with the tragic costs of internecine warfare, forcing him to modify his optimistic vision of the American experiment in liberty. What emerged in his new poems, in his revisions of Song of Myself, and in his prose, particularly Memoranda during the war, was the philosophical grid within which many modern poets operate, including Rethke, A.R. Ammons, Galway Cannell, and Mark Strand, all of whom shaped my thinking. On the mantle of my grandparents' house in Maryland was a blood-stained bullet chiseled out of a tree on the battlefield at Gettysburg. I liked to roll it between my fingers as a child, imagining what it would have been like to fight on the Union side, little knowing that someday I would find myself reporting on the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia. There I would learn firsthand why people raise arms against their fellow citizens, repudiating what Whitman celebrated in his preface to the first edition of Leaves of Grass. Quote, "The messages of great poets to each man and woman are, come to us on equal terms. Only then can you understand us. We are no better than you. What we enclose, you enclose. What we enjoy, you may enjoy." Close quote. The bloodshed compelled the first great American poet to revise his ideas about his country's future, demanding more freedom, equality, and fraternity, ever mindful of the consequences of failure. "Where have you disposed of their carcasses?" he asks in This Compost, knowing that if he were to press his spade into the sod and turn it over, he would expose some of the foul meat. What I was learning in the nursery, in the life cycles of flowers and trees, in our dependence on sunlight and water, in the beauty of landscape designs that imitate patterns found in nature, is that poetry grows from the soil like the dogwood tree, my totem. Jerry's malicious gesture was of a piece with what we all do to the earth, generating garbage, polluting the air and water, and burning fossil fuels which heat the atmosphere, melt ice packs, raise sea levels. The foreman chastised Jerry before we pushed the truck out of the mud, and from the look of contrition on his face, I suspected that he would not pull such a stunt again. Individuals and nations have the capacity to self-correct. And as the tires spun, I realized that this was the sort of juncture at which one either comes to one's senses or continues down the road to destruction. It so happened that I was approaching my own turning point, which I should have foreseen. Ordered to eradicate slugs in the nursery, I spent 3 days mixing batches of a sweet-smelling pesticide to spray under the trees and tables of flowers, along the paths and around the greenhouse, all without bothering to wear gloves or a mask. The lump I discovered in my neck at Christmas I attributed to my carelessness with the poison, which must have seeped into my body. When I wrote about this in Things of the Hidden God, Journey to the Holy Mountain, treating the matter through the lens of a spiritual crisis, I left out a detail about my recovery from surgery to excise the tumor and several swollen lymph nodes, which proved to be benign. Recuperating at a friend's house in Kirkland, my head swathed in bandages like a turban, I set off on foot one sunlit morning for the nursery, a walk of more than a mile, because I wanted to see my friends, to wander among the blooming azaleas and camellias, to smell the fragrance of bark and flowers, to be in a place that is devoted to growing things. I thought, this is my home. What I should just add to close that story is that around this time, I was given a friend got me a job working, doing some technical writing for what was then a new software company, whatever that might have been. This was 1979. And the work, it paid $75 an hour, which was an astronomical sum at the time. I was probably making about $4.25 an hour in the nursery. And after I completed the work, it was some kind of technical manual, which I just found incredibly boring and had no idea what I was actually correcting. My friend said, well, they like the work you did, and I think you could get a job if you like. This company is going to be growing, and I think you can see where this is going. It was Microsoft. And I was like, no, I'm much happier digging up trees and planting things. So we would be having an altogether different kind of conversation if I'd taken a job, I think. But I kept on with the gardening and eventually found myself in other kinds of interesting moments about which I write in this book. And maybe with that, I'll open it up to questions and discussion.
Great. Well, as Chris said, there's, we're open to questions. You can put your questions or comments in the chat, and I can call you out, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask away.
This is that pregnant silence. I see my friend Gail Ronsky here. And Gail, you'll be happy to know I wrote about our classmate, Kevin Cantwell, in this book. Gail and I were students of Mark Strand at the University of Utah a very long time ago. And part of the way I made a living there was working as a gardener, and Kevin and I had a job together. I hired Kevin to help me clear some space, and that did not, and I see Chuck there too. Hey, Chuck Rosenthal, wonderful novelist and poet, and Gail's selected poems, I think, has just come out from White Pine Press. It looks fabulous. Gail said to me when we first met each other in Salt Lake, I said, have you always been a surrealist poet? And she said, no, I wasn't a surrealist till I got here. And now you just walk around this desert and you become a surrealist. So that's a journey we've been on together a long time. But there's this scene where Kevin and I are trying to clear some ironwood trees, and with a chainsaw, and I hit a spike in a tree, and the chainsaw bucked, and it cut Kevin right across his thigh. And to this day, I still remember he just, he's starting to bleed, and it's quite close to an artery that he could easily have bled out. And he looked so calm, and he said, yeah, you got me there. And then we had to race to get him fixed up. And thank God I don't have his death on my conscience as well. But that was what came out of Salt Lake. Yeah,
that reminds me of another kind of similar experience of your own. working at Merwin's on that former plantation, where you would cut yourself and you weren't sure what that was about, what happened, and how you were starting to feel some of those effects. But one of the questions that's in the chat is, what did you learn about Merwin as a gardener that you can share with us? And if you might add to that, just some of those, kind of that extensive experience of working with him, for him, around him. I mean, there's a whole lot of relationship that went on that's beyond the page.
Well, I had the great good fortune to house sit for the Merwins for 4 springs back in the early 90s. I had been a caretaker in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and invited William to a writers' conference I created called the Taos Conference on Writing in the Natural World. And after the conference, he came back to Santa Fe and spent a night in the cottage, and he's in one of the cottages on this estate. And he saw that I had to take care of about a dozen gardens, and he was always looking for someone to come and take care of his really what is now a botanical preserve, 19 acres of land that had been pineappled. That is to say that the soil was just completely depleted, and he lovingly brought that back to life. And so for 4 years, I would go to his house for anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to take care of the 4 chow chows that he had, and literally thousands of palms that he had planted that were either endangered or extinct in the wild. And collect his mail, which was voluminous. And I would usually go a few days early so I could spend time with him. I wanted to be in his company. And among the things that I learned during that time was we would walk around the garden, and I would ask him the name of a particular palm, and he would look at me. And he always had this look of just complete chagrin, like, "You don't know that?" Of course I didn't know it, and he would rattle off the Latin name that I would promptly forget. But what I remember about that was that the loving attention that he paid to every single plant in his garden was what eventually would come out in poems that he was writing. He would say to me that a poem might begin with him just being in the garden, weeding and paying attention to something, and then the poem would sneak up on him. And he made a point of writing first drafts of poems, sometimes on boarding passes from airplanes, on the backs of envelopes. He wanted always to the poem would sneak up on him, something like that. He didn't want to just sit down with the blank page and start writing, but it would come out of an act of attention. And so those are the kinds of things I would learn from him. I think what Curtis is talking about, there was a moment I went straight, in those days I was covering the war in the former Yugoslavia. And at one point I went pretty much straight from Sarajevo to Maui, which was, that was a change from a besieged city with no gas, water, or electricity and people shooting all the time, to this idyllic place. And, Merwin's wife, Paula, would leave would leave before I got there, and she would leave William notes, 4 or 5 pages of notes about everything from like how to cook rice, how to cook an egg, and which was kind of funny. He couldn't really cook anything, and so I would usually do the cooking. And one day I was making a salad at lunchtime, and I cut my finger slicing onions, and I put it out of my mind. I went back to continuing to make the salad, and I thought the salad needed capers. So I went looking in this cupboard, and I couldn't find any capers, but I saw this little this puddle of water, and I looked at it, and I looked at William. I said, "What do you think that is?" And he stuck his finger in the puddle and licked it. And so then I did the same thing too, because I was stupid, and but I happened to stick the finger in that I just cut. And then I thought, well, maybe I should look a little closer because it didn't really taste like water. And I looked a little further, and there was a swollen can of lychees that had that had burst. And I pulled it out and I showed it to William, and he looked at me and very calmly said, "Well, we all have to die sometime." And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is our time. We sat down and we started eating, and we were talking, and suddenly I couldn't quite understand what he was saying, and it seemed like everything was just whirling around me. And he later said that my face turned about 7 different shades of white and then green. And I got up and I went and I grabbed the can, and I said to him, "I think we better get to the hospital." And he looked at me and he said, "It's 45 minutes away. We'll never make it in time." I thought, and that made a kind of sense. I thought, all right, well, if I'm going to die, it's, I'm dying here in Maui. I survived Sarajevo, and I'm going to go out on botulism on Williams Lanai. There are worse fates, And so I followed him into the garden, and we continued working, or he continued working. I didn't really feel that well. I didn't quite get sick, but I was in pretty bad shape, and later that night or late in the afternoon, I drove him to the airport in Maui, which was near the hospital. And I said to him, I think I might go over to the hospital after this. And he said, "Oh, I just go back. You'll be okay." And I dropped him off. I drove back to his place, and I got in bed, and I was basically delirious for about the next 3 or 4 days, sweating and hallucinating. And I always thought, my God, I survived snipers' bullets in Sarajevo to do myself in drinking lychee juice at Merwin's house. But what I really learned from him, the great thing about taking care of their house was he had such an amazing library, and I would read through all of his books. I wandered those places, and I felt that I was in the company of a really, really great poet and writer who was also very funny, and I considered myself a kind of disciple of him.
Another question is from, let's see, Gretchen Rumer. Can you share whether you've always tuned in to your natural surroundings to inform your writing?
Hey, Gretchen, how are you? I wish I could say I did, but I think I'm like anybody. I remember what John Cage said, quoting Thoreau. He said, music is continuous, listening intermittent. And I would say that I'm very much on the intermittent side, on the listening to the music of nature. But there is some part of me that I think is probably more alert when I'm wandering out into the woods than I would ordinarily be, simply because I have spent so many happy hours wandering in the woods and getting lost in a moment, looking at something that at some point down the road might find its way into a piece of writing. I wish I could be on all the time, but I'm human.
But it seems like in this book, in Self-Portrait with Dogwood, where there are these different chapters, you're always finding some connection to this tree that, is this talisman. And it's something that is carrying through your life, right? There are these threads that you're following, and you're seeing it across the world.
Exactly.
And that's pretty fascinating how you're able to draw those connections. And, if you travel someplace to look for a dogwood in, let's say Afghanistan or Pakistan or, wherever you might be.
Well, I think that the love of nature would be an abiding concern, and something that is always somewhere in my thinking. But I guess the next thing that comes to mind is there is a chapter in this book where I go to Taiwan. I was invited by the Ministry of Culture to, they were trying to figure out ways for the international writing program, and Taiwanese writers to work together. And they asked me if there was anything I wanted to do. And I said, I'd really like to see an Asian dogwood, Kusa dogwood. And so sure enough, they found a retired military guy. He'd been a spy who was now one of the guides in this huge national park, which is is within Taipei's city limits. And as he said to me, it's 120 square miles. There was one dogwood there. And we met him at around 10 o'clock in the morning. He'd already been hiked 2 hours in to find out, to see that it was still there and it was alive, and then hiked out 2 more hours. And then we hiked in for a second time for him to find this tree. And along the way, it gave me a chance to talk about some of the issues that, some of the political issues that were derived from my job of directing the International Writing Program. We invite Chinese writers, Taiwanese writers, Hong Kong writers. It's always a thorny and complicated dance that we do with the different, the writers from the different places. And, you know, if you see Tony Blinken's speech yesterday at the State Department, arguing that China will remain our biggest competitor, someone we will compete with when we should, and steel ourselves against when we also, when there are other forces at work. And so my job at the International Writing Program, I have to navigate those kinds of things. And if I have a little bit of time to go try to find a dogwood, that's good for me. And mind you, the book I wrote about the war in the former Yugoslavia, Only the Nails Remain, that began as a magazine piece for Sierra. It was going to be 2 poets walking across Slovenia, then the northernmost republic of Yugoslavia, after the Cold War, you know, drinking wine, telling stories, doing the things that poets do. And I arrived in time for a war. And so I pretty much stayed and wrote a big book about that. So the nature is a constant, but sometimes human civilization gets in the way of those stories, and you have to tell a different kind of story. So the piece I wrote for Sierra magazine on that, about that walking across Slovenia, we walked across one mountain range, my friend and I, and on the 3rd day of that hike, we came to a mountain hut where we had planned to stay, and it was filled with refugees from Bosnia. And I was walking with the late Slovenian poet Lech Debeljak, and he looked at me and he said, "I don't have the heart to ask them any questions." And I think at that moment I realized, oh, I'm going to come back. I'm going to write about this. There's more to this. And I when I got back to the States, I called the editor at Sierra and I said, you know, it's going to be a different story than you thought you were going to get. And she said, oh, write it anyway. I did, and I probably got the fastest kill fee in American publishing history. But I was in, and I knew I would be going back and trying to write more about that complicated war. And one of the things that was always in the back of my mind is that, you know, Yugoslavia had about the same population as the US did at the time of our civil war, 22 million people. Maybe 150,000 people were killed in the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia, and 800,000 in our civil war. And as we know, that, you know, the legacy of that war is still with us in profound ways. And so that gave me a different kind of perspective to think about those parallels.
Well, connected to that, Edward Carey has a question. Chris, is a man who's endlessly traveling and seeing the world. How does your life feel now, limited to Iowa and living with only a view of Iowa wildlife?
Yeah, Edward, it is so weird. You know, I said, the late Marvin Bell and I wrote close to 3 books of prose poems back and forth, and a project that came to an end when he passed away in December. And in one of them, for some reason, Marvin wrote a piece about Tangiers. And I thought, well, I'll reply to that. And I started thinking about a trip I had made to Tangiers and visiting the tomb of the great medieval traveler and writer Ibn Battuta. And so I just thought, oh, I might find something there. And I started reading more about Ibn Battuta. And I realized that he had spent 30 years traveling. He was really maybe the greatest traveler of medieval Islam, traveled for 30 years and maybe hundreds of thousands of miles. And after 30 years, the Sultan called him back and ordered him to write an account of his travels. And I thought to myself, well, that's funny. I traveled steadily for 30 years, and now the pandemic has brought that to an end. I mean, not that I was going to write an account as magnificent as Ibn Battuta, but I thought, well, now I'm in a different space, and I haven't left the country in a year, and that's really weird. So, but of course, everybody's in the same boat, right?
Yeah. I mean, Alexis is up in upstate New York writing short stories that he never thought that he would write, right? And so here we are. Yeah. I'm gonna combine a couple of questions. One, what type of literary elements do you use in your poems? And then is there a certain place where you felt more inspired to write poems? And maybe I'll just toss in there, getting back to this theme of forests and thinking about another quote that you use early on in Self-Portrait is an anecdote of Stanley Kunitz telling young poets, if you want to do this, if you want to write poems, do something else, study something else, and it's going to help you, come up with better metaphors, right? So, maybe if you can think of a way of bringing all that together.
Well, I think one thing that leads to more poems is when I have a prose deadline facing me. That deadline always makes me want to write poetry instead of the prose. So in this last year, since I've had a very big deadline looming, I've written many, many more poems than pages of prose, and that's a problem, but we won't go into that. Stanley Kunitz is that line of Kunitz is, he said, it will clean up your metaphors. Comes out of him remembering a phone call he had with Richard Wilbur on the night that John Berryman committed suicide. And what Kunitz and Wilbur were saying was that because they got their hands in the dirt pretty regularly, they felt that gave them at least some kind of an outlet, some space in which to, forget about poetry, forget about everything else. And Kunitz made the point that for Berryman, it was only poetry. That was all he had. And, that's a reductive way to describe what happened to Berryman. But there is a certain truth to that, in that if you think about a poet like Gary Snyder talking about learning different arts, learning how to do woodworking, how to garden, how to preserve things, that might provide you with the kind of balance. I felt that I was learning something about that from Merwin in the time I spent with him, and he would always say to me, "Oh, whatever you do, you've got to maintain your independence," and that's not something that I was able to do to the ruthless degree that he did. But it was an ideal that I found useful. So that's might be how I would do that. I would say to myself that the gardening was an antidote to anxiety about writing. And then at some points it becomes a useful way to just forget about writing for a long time. And then the back starts to hurt and you go back to the page and see what you can make.
Yeah. Anyone else have some questions or comments?
Curtis, could I ask a question?
Yeah, please, please.
So Chris, in your opening remarks, you were talking about the origins of the book, and you said that presented with this sort of prompt of writing about a certain tree, Dogwood jumped out immediately. And you were referencing some of the parts of the book, and you said, for instance, you had this sort of point of reference in your memory of the Dogwood with Kennedy's assassination. But given the theme, as Curtis mentioned, is forest, I'm wondering about, is there something about the dogwoodness of dogwoods themselves that also sort of piques your imagination beyond just those more personal references? Is there something that draws you to it for what it is outside
Well,
of you?
yeah, there are so many parts about it. For one thing, when we think about blossoming dogwoods, they're actually not blossoming. The petals turn that very beautiful white or sometimes pink in the spring. One of the things that made me think early on that I might be able to write this book was that I was doing some research on dogwoods and realized that around the time I started to work in the nursery, the native dogwoods started dying out in this country, afflicted with powdery mildew and a form of anthracnose. And this was coming from the Asian dogwoods that I was transplanting all around Seattle, in the suburbs of Seattle, because the nursery that I worked in, in addition to being a scoundrel, Jerry Monroe was a really, really beautiful gardener, and he had an eye for exotic plants. He would travel to Hawaii every year to buy orchids, and it grieved him to no end that after orchids would bloom in Hawaii, they just throw them out, because for him, you never throw anything out. You just bring it back and put it up in the back of the nursery and water it and assume it will come back. But among the things that he was bringing in were the Asian dogwoods, which we were planting in many places without knowing that they carried the anthracnose that killed off the many of the native dogwoods. There's a little bit in the book about Reagan showing up at Camp David and saying to a ranger, "What is going on with all the trees here?" They were all the dogwoods at Camp David were dying off. And I remember thinking to myself, gee, isn't that funny? Here's this tree I love, and I was planting those trees that were helping to kill off the native dogwoods. It seemed to me that it was, as Stanley Kunitz might say, here's a clean metaphor for some of the complications of a life. So I wanted to write about those kinds of matters, and also my family lived in North Carolina for many years, and there are, really beautiful dogwoods in lots of places of North Carolina. But then doing some research into, say, looking at William Bartram's travels from the early 18th century, he describes 70 miles of dogwoods, and of course they're all gone. First, many of them were cut down, and then they've also suffered from dogwood anthracnose. So just wanting to write about those kinds of things, that piqued my interest. And then I'll say just the book ends with, again, I'm always reluctant to get too personal, but in this case, as I was writing the book, my younger daughter was very sick and had been very sick for a couple of years, and we were not going to be able to figure out it took a trip to the Mayo Clinic in the summer there to get her on track. She had a disease called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Soldier's heart is what it used to be called, but it takes a very long time to diagnose that. And at one point when she was really sick in the summer, we went for, I thought I'd get her out of the house, take her to the City Park pool in Iowa City, and just to get her mind on something else. And we get there, and I realized right at the entrance to City Park were two absolutely beautiful Asian dogwoods, and it completely filled with white petals. And I remember looking at that and thinking, gee, all these times I've come to the pool and not even noticed that there were dogwoods here. And because I was thinking so much about my daughter at the time, that seemed like a little sign from somewhere else. Interestingly, part of what we went through with at the Mayo Clinic was to find that one of the ways to remedy this syndrome is you basically have to rewire the brain, because for reasons no one has ever really figured out, the nervous system just shuts down, and that's what had happened to her. And then that summer, she ended up in this pain rehabilitation program at Mayo, and there they were. The way it ends with you see all these kids walking around with these salt shakers because they have to drink a lot of water and put extra salt on everything. There's something in the osmosis of the salt that helps to turn this around. And and for the first 6 months after they leave, we were not allowed to ask her how she was feeling, and you're not to take them to a doctor because you're trying to get the brain to create new neural connections to rewire the brain and to, in effect, rewrite your life story. And that seemed all bound up in the kinds of issues that I was trying to write about in this book. So it ends, the last chapter is called Heart Condition, and it's about my daughter, the trials that we went through trying to get her well. Wow, what's that? Somebody
it was an idea. Someone just had from what you said.
Yeah. So to go back to what type of literary elements do you use in your poems? I didn't really answer that. I use everything I can, you read widely, you steal from everybody you can, and then you have no idea what's going to work. But in that sense, Merwin again was a great model for me because he wrote in so many different forms. He translated so extensively, prominently from Spanish and French, but also from other languages. And he wrote beautiful prose. He wrote those fables. I would like to think that all of those forms and elements are available to me when I'm trying to write. But usually it's just trying to get from one word to the next without making a complete hash of it all.
Can I speak? Can I say, yeah, I noticed you did your nursery work in the Seattle area, which is where Ruthke, I believe, did his. And yeah. I'm just wondering if you felt the consanguinity with him, with the earth, the rootedness, that wonderful poem about the roots down in the cellar, and of course the Rose House, like a ship in a storm. That seems right up your alley, all that.
Well, I went to Seattle to study with David Wagoner, who was Ruthke's student. And in his workshops, he often told stories about Ruthke to us that were always instructive. And when I take the international writers on what we call mid-residency travels, we've often taken them to Seattle. And I love to go out to this place called the Bladel Preserve, which is a house, and where friends of Ruthke used to live, timber barons of all things. And there's an extraordinarily beautiful Zen garden, which, as it turns out, was once a swimming pool, the swimming pool in which Ruthke died when he had a heart attack while he was swimming. So I'd love to take the writers there, and just at the moment that they're all, exclaiming about how beautiful this garden is, I tell them that's where Theodore Ruthke died. And that changes the whole dynamics in a hurry. But and studying with Wagoner, there was such a attention to trying to get physical details right from the natural world, and he got that, I think, as much from Ruthke as from anyone. And he passed that on to several generations of American poets.
Another idea.
Yeah.
Other questions? Anyone else have a comment? Something that they'd like to?
I see my friend John Wells, whose new book just arrived here today, Debris. It's really beautiful. It is such a handsome production of a book. And I might say Edward Carey's new novel, which he just read from here at Prairie Lights. With the wonders of virtual readings, we have the chance to be in everybody's living room or office at any hour of the day.
Yeah, there are people from across the country here tonight, which is...
Yeah. Oh, and Hilma Wolitzer. How are you, Hilma? Wow. Old home week.
Yeah.
Shall I read just the last page then?
Yeah, why don't you close us
Yeah.
out with something that wraps it all up for us? That'd be great.
The epilogue, it begins with Merwin. On the last day of the world, W.S. Merwin wrote, I would want to plant a tree. Here at the end of my book, I pick up a small plastic bag containing a dozen seeds of flowering dogwood, a gift from a friend at the State Department. I will plant them in a row along the fence in our backyard, in the partial shade of the white oaks towering overhead. Flowering dogwoods are not considered winter hardy in eastern Iowa, but with rising temperatures from the greenhouse effect extending the range of Cornus florida, I have decided to mulch the bed with sawdust to protect the seeds over the winter. And when the snow melts next spring, I will clear the ground for seedlings to emerge. These I will water regularly under a cloth hung to shield them from the sun. By late summer, they should be strong enough to survive on their own. In the space between the fence and the ravine at the edge of our property, I may plant other species of dogwoods, better suited to Iowa: gray, silky, pagoda, Tatarian, Cornelian cherry, red osier, to bring more color and light to this patch of land above the Iowa River coursing through the city. The white oaks in our neighborhood are succumbing to wilt, and there is no telling how long the stately pear in my yard will last. The one to the east has already withstood a lightning strike that sheared off a third of its trunk, the falling branches destroying my daughter's play structure and swing set. The one to the north is thick with dead limbs, which must be removed before they break off in a storm and crash into the garage. These dogwoods will thus eventually grow in full sun, producing more flowers in the spring and brighter colors in the fall, attracting birds, squirrels, raccoons, and deer from the ravine. At the first sign of disease, of blight or anthracnose or powdery mildew, the dead or dying branches must be pruned and the fallen leaves raked up, which I will do if I am still around. If not, I will take comfort in the knowledge that something remains. And I think that's what we try to do as writers, right? Leave something that remains.
Yeah.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Please give one more round of virtual applause, distanced applause to Christopher Merrill for a wonderful conversation tonight. And thank you so much to Curtis Bauer for moderating and hosting tonight's event. I encourage you to go register for all of the remaining events in the Forest Speaker Series. Next up, we will be talking about photography, so please come out for that. And as always, I'd like to give thanks to Justin Hughes, the Executive Administrative Assistant from the Humanities Center, who helps us keep everything running. Thank you so much again, and have a great evening.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night, Chris. Great to see you.
Good night. Thank you.